In a luxury hotel located on the coast of France, there is a man named Jean who works as a bartender. In addition to working as a bartender, Jean also took another side job, being a waiter at the hotel. Jean was very tired, because almost all of his time he used to work. But he needed extra money to finance his life. Jean is willing to work from early morning until late at night. On the other hand, there is a woman named Irene who is the mistress of a rich old man. In contrast to Jean, who has to work hard to earn money, Irene doesn't need to do more to support her life. Because all her needs have been supported by her boyfriend. One day, when Jean was getting ready to go home, suddenly he was called by one of the guests who were still there. Apparently the man was a rich businessman. He asked Jean to accompany him to talk that night. At first, Jean refused to accompany the man on the grounds that he was not allowed to leave the bar for long. But because the man insisted, finally Jean accompanied him. When the two were talking, the man handed Jean an expensive cigar and invited him to drink. Shortly after they talked, Jean, who was very tired, finally fell asleep and the man left him. A few moments later, Irene, who happened to be at the hotel, came and saw Jean who was sleeping on the bar sofa with an expensive cigar beside him. Irene, who thought that Jean was a rich young man, then woke him and asked him to talk. When they met, Jean did not reveal clearly about his job as an employee at the hotel. This made Irene even more sure that Jean was a VIP guest who was renting a bar that night. Irene revealed that that night was her birthday. Jean wanted to cheer her up, so he made a special drink for Irene. After finishing her drink, Irene, who was under the influence of alcohol, asked Jean to take her to Jean's room. Jean, who did have access to every room in the hotel, then took Irene to the most luxurious room. Irene is increasingly convinced that Jean is a rich man. Irene teases Jean, until in the end, the two of them make love and spend the night together. The next morning, Jean realized that Irene was no longer with him. He was looking for the woman's whereabouts. But unfortunately, it turns out that the woman has left the hotel. It made Jean very sad, because he already liked the woman. Long story short, 1 year later, when Jean was serving guests, he accidentally saw Irene. At that time, Irene was with her boyfriend. Jean didn't want the woman to know that he was just an employee at the hotel. He immediately took off his waiter's tie and acted like a guest. Irene, who saw Jean's presence, was very surprised. But because she is currently with her boyfriend, she then ignores Jean. That night, Jean met Irene who was also looking for him. After they talked, they went back to spending the night together. After spending the night with Jean, Irene returns to her room to meet her lover. When she entered the room, Irene was surprised when she found out her credit card had been broken by her boyfriend, who knew about her affair. After they had a little debate, the man finally left Irene and took all the valuables he gave to the woman. Although Irene was upset because her rich lover left her, Irene realized that she had now found a replacement for him. Irene immediately went to Jean who was still in his room. Jean who saw Irene's presence was nervous, because he was afraid that other employees would find him in a hotel room with a woman. But because Jean couldn't tell the truth and he didn't want to lose Irene, he allowed Irene to stay there. Not long after, guests who will stay in the room arrived. And finally, Jean's cover was exposed. After knowing that Jean was not a rich man but only an employee at the hotel, without many words, Irene immediately left him. At that time, Jean felt very embarrassed. Irene began to despair, because she had not found a replacement for her ex. She then tried to contact every rich man she had ever met. With the hope, she can get one of the men, so that she can return to enjoying a luxurious life without working. One day, Irene had the opportunity to get acquainted with the grandson of a wealthy businessman named Frank. After talking, they finally agreed to meet at an expensive restaurant. When Irene was waiting for the man, she was suddenly surprised by the presence of Jean who wanted to take her to dinner at a restaurant, as an expression of his apology. Irene was still very upset with Jean, and she didn't want Frank to see them together. Irene immediately chased Jean away. But not long after, Frank came and immediately approached Irene. While they were talking, Frank's gaze shifted to Jean who seemed to be watching them from a distance. Frank, who apparently saw Irene talking to the man, then assumed that the man was in trouble with Irene. Frank, who did not want to get into trouble, then immediately left Irene. Here, Irene is getting annoyed that Jean made her lose a rich man. Irene approached Jean. But instead of being angry, Irene accepted Jean's invitation for dinner. Irene then chose the most expensive restaurant in town and ordered expensive food. So in order to pay for the meal, Jean had to ask his boss to transfer all of his salary bonuses that night. They haven't had much time to talk, but Irene has already left and asked Jean to prepare an expensive hotel for her. Jean thought that Irene would forgive him and would give him a second chance. Jean then complied with the woman's request. Arriving there, Irene didn't care about Jean at all. Not a single word came out of the woman's mouth. So that night, Jean's hopes were in vain. The next morning, Jean was called by someone. It turns out his credit card is over limit because it has been used to shop for expensive items by Irene. Jean, who had already fallen in love with Irene, was not angry at all when he found out about it, because that way, Irene could be with him. Besides that, Irene, who apparently had managed to avenge Jean by spending all his money, then walked away leaving Jean who was still expecting her. Arriving at the hotel, Jean forgot that his credit card was over the limit. He then handed over the credit card to pay the hotel bill, but the receptionist handed the card back because it couldn't be used. Gene didn't have a penny. He then asked for leniency at the hotel. But the hotel refused and instead reported him to the police. At the same time, an old woman named Madeline came up to Gene and paid all the bills free of charge. Apparently, Madeline was fascinated by Gene's good looks. She also plans to approach the man. After the conversation, Madeline frankly asked Gene to be her boyfriend, in exchange for giving him everything he wanted. At first, Gene refused to accept Madeline's offer. But when he saw Irene was with her new boyfriend, Gene felt hurt. He then accepted an offer from Madeline. One time, Irene accidentally met Gene while enjoying breakfast with her lover. Irene thought that Gene was still following her. She then approached Gene and asked him to leave. But suddenly, Madeline came. So Gene walked away, leaving Irene confused. The next day, Gene went shopping with Madeline. There, he again met Irene, who was also with her lover. Coincidentally, the changing rooms were right next to each other. They then talked. When Irene asked about Madeline, Gene felt awkward and argued that the old woman was his friend. But still, Irene didn't believe it, let alone Madeline bought clothes for Gene for free. Irene was sure that Gene had become the old woman's mistress. One day, Irene called Gene to stop by her house. After showing Gene her luxury items, Irene asked Gene what he had gotten during his time with Madeline. Gene said that Madeline had just bought 4 clothes for him. Instantly, Irene advised Gene to ask his girlfriend for more, so that his efforts were not in vain. Irene seems to want to take more advantage of the woman. She immediately taught Gene several ways to make his girlfriend submissive. At first, Gene didn't want to follow Irene's advice because he didn't feel comfortable asking Madeline for more. But Gene felt that Madeline had only made him like a slave without getting the proper reciprocity. He then returned to Irene and told his frustration. Gene had not wanted to reveal the truth that he was a mistress. But in the end, he began to dare to open up with Irene. Even Gene wants to learn from Irene, who has experience in draining rich men's treasures. When Irene was about to teach Gene how to seduce women, she got carried away. Unconsciously, she began to fall in love with Gene. But because Irene doesn't want to have feelings for a man who doesn't have wealth, she then pushes those feelings away. Not long after, Gene got a phone call from Madeline asking him to see her immediately. That day, they would go to the surgeon to change Gene's ear, which Madeline didn't like. Although Gene didn't really want to do the operation, but because the woman insisted, in the end he followed Madeline's wish. Along the way home, Gene could only grumble because his life was arranged according to the woman's wishes. Madeline, who began to realize that her boyfriend was angry, immediately gave him a luxurious and expensive watch. Of course, that made Gene very happy. Besides, Gene knew Madeline's weak point. He started acting up. Whenever Madeline made a mistake, Gene would feign anger and threaten to leave her. So that Madeline is afraid and will grant all of Gene's wishes. Seeing Gene's success made Irene happy too. The man managed to follow the advice she gave. But even so, there is actually a feeling of jealousy that Irene can't just get rid of when she sees Gene with his girlfriend. One time, Gene took Irene to travel to the beach using a new motorbike bought by Madeline. Irene was happy with Gene's invitation. She immediately accepted the offer. After both of them left the hotel without their respective partners knowing, they immediately went to the beach. While they were there, they really enjoyed their moments together. However, the morning light had appeared, so they had to return to the hotel. In the afternoon, Irene met Gene in his room. Irene will go out of town and leave the hotel with her boyfriend. Irene said goodbye to Gene. Irene, who realized that she had fallen in love with Gene, then expressed her feelings before she actually left. At the same time, Madeline came, so Gene immediately hit Irene. While trying to hide Irene, Gilles, Irene's lover, unwittingly saw their togetherness. It made Gilles immediately leave Irene and took all the luxurious things that he had given. On the other hand, Gene feels sorry for Irene, because she doesn't have money and a place to take shelter. He then sold his precious watch to rent a hotel for Irene. Not only that, Gene also gave Irene a luxurious dress from the sale of watches. So that Madeline wouldn't be suspicious, Gene bought the woman a piece of jewelry. Gene confessed that he sold his watch because he didn't have the money to give Madeline a present. At a party, Irene accidentally saw her ex-boyfriend, Jacques, who was with his new girlfriend. Irene wants to get back her better life together with that man. She then asked Gene for help to seduce Agnes, Jacques' lover, by pretending to be a prince. Without thinking, Gene carried out the orders requested by Irene. After successfully getting her acquainted, Gene invited Agnes to take a walk around the hotel. Besides, Madeline, who saw her lover now with another woman, asked Gene to leave Agnes. However, because Gene wanted to help Irene, he refused to comply with Madeline's request. So that made Madeline angry and left him. Irene felt guilty for the incident. Now, Gene lost his source of money just to be able to help Irene. After successfully seducing Agnes, the woman finally wanted to leave Jacques. So Irene immediately approached Jacques. But when Irene was about to seduce Jacques, her eyes immediately shifted to Gene, who was currently making out with Agnes. Irene, who was jealous to see Gene with Agnes, felt that she couldn't just let go of a good man like Gene. She then left Jacques and approached Gene. After meeting Jean and Agnes in the room, Irene then confessed to Agnes that Jean was not a prince, but just an ordinary man. Agnes, who knew about it, immediately left Jean. Irene then expresses her feelings for Jean. Although Jean is not a rich man, Irene loves him and doesn't care about his status and wealth. So she can now accept Jean just the way he is. On the other hand, Jean still had the treasure Madeline had given him. He plans to sell some of his belongings to go out of town and find a new life with Irene, the woman he loves.